Commissioner Merritt,
Here.
Commissioner Maddox. Here. Commissioner Minor,
Here.
Commissioner Richardson.
Here.
Commissioner Williams Cox.
Here.
Are there any agenda modifications?
No, sir.
Move on to citizen comment. Sierra?
Do we need a motion to approve the minutes? Okay, sorry.
This is Sierra Anderson with Senator Rick Scott's office.
Hi, y'all. I saw you the other week. My name is Sierra Anderson. I serve as the Northwest Florida District Director for Senator Scott. We are happy to be in our new role, and we're doing a lot of different things that we couldn't do before, and there are some things that we used to do as governor that we can't do anymore. But I will be serving as the primary community liaison for the counties of Madison, Taylor, and all the way over to Escambia. So that includes Leon and many of the counties represented today. It is very far. I will be representing many of the counties that are here today, so please feel free to contact me at any point. I did provide my contact information. No, I do not have cards, nor do I have an office yet, but I'm happy to meet with anyone and everyone who needs something from our office. So thank you all for having us.
You need to set up your office in Wakulla County.
I already told you it has to go to Pensacola. I didn't pick that. And the senator does serve on the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, so all of the wonderful work that you guys are doing here is pertinent to us, and we might be able to be a little more helpful to you all since we do sit on that committee. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for coming.
You, Sierra.
Is there a motion on the consent agenda?
So move.
Any objections? All right, moving right along. Greg?
Yes, sir. First up on the agenda today, item 6A, we have a presentation from Carl McKiska. Oh, there he is. I lost him. Last month, Commissioner Maddox, who serves as the MPOAC statewide chair, requested Carl come and give you all an update on the legislative session that kicked off last week. So with that, Carl, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. So legislative session is well underway. There's a number of transportation bills that are being considered by both the House and the Senate. Those are highlighted in the weekly newsletter that we put out and is shared with you. Do want to talk a little bit about some of the priorities of MPOAC, which do represent the statewide priorities of the MPOs. Primarily want to focus on transportation revenues. Revenue forecasts going forward are relatively flat. A lot of that is due to the fact that our transportation, our vehicles that we are consuming, driving, are getting better fuel mileage, part of the CAFE standards. That and the introduction of electric vehicles, which will increasingly take market share away from gasoline-powered vehicles, are going to flatline our revenues because our revenues are based upon sales of gallonage of fuel, motor fuel. Unfortunately, as we go forward, inflation will not flatline. You'll see construction costs likely rise due to inflation, which will diminish our purchasing power for that. So that is something we want to consider. There is going to, at some point, need to be other ways of funding our transportation system. Yes, sir.
I had a wild idea. I've presented a few times. The only other consumable I can think of on a vehicle are tires. And I don't know if you're looking at, even an electric car wears tires out.
Yes. Tires are a consumable item. Each vehicle obviously will be registered each year. That is an avenue. And there's also been a consideration at one point or another of looking at the mileage that is driven per year and using that as a factor. One thing I can say that is very nice, here in Florida, we generate a great deal of our revenue statewide rather than depend on the federal government. Only about 25% of the budget for Florida transportation comes from the federal government. There are many states that rely for 80% or more of their funding from the federal government. As that money diminishes in purchasing power, those states will face a real crisis as we are feeling somewhat uncomfortable. That crisis will come to a head at a federal level before we have a full-blown crisis here in Florida. And you will see likely some form of a federal fix long before we need to really start sweating. So I feel positive about that. A couple of other quick things. There is the Transportation Regional Incentive Program called TRIP. It is a program that's designed for MPOs and local units of government to access funds. It was established back when the SIS was programmed. Inside our legislative brochure, we have a bar chart, and it's in your meeting packet. It shows the decline in the purchasing power. That has primarily to do with the fact that many things are being drawn down from the documentary tax stamps before the money reaches the TRIP program. We are asking to restore that funding to 2007 levels. It is not the highest level of funding it achieved, but it was around $150 million statewide. So it's not an insignificant sum. And then lastly, you'll see every year in the legislature bills that are supportive of autonomous vehicles and technology in transportation. We have a couple of those bills advancing currently. Those are going to be annual bills because technology moves so rapidly. In summary, and I just want to wrap up the legislative session over there, we are seeing that each chamber has their definitive priorities, as well as the governor. When those priorities meet in the budget, we'll see what shakes out from there. But in the Senate side, there's a strong desire for transportation and infrastructure. In the House, you're going to see health care, school choice. The governor is very big on the environment, particularly water quality. So it'll be an interesting budget session. I'm going to open up to questions. Me talking is probably the least important part of it. Hearing from you is the more important part.
Anybody? Have y'all? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Just a
No,
quick
you don't need
question.
to raise.
What, has OPAGA done a report on revenue estimating at this point?
There has been an estimate done on revenue for the coming year. There's forecasted to be a slight decline. I don't know the specifics of it, but there is some money that's been set aside in a rainy day fund of sorts that will allow the legislature to maintain the same level of funding for the state overall. The governor did propose a much larger budget.
Right.
The House was very clear that that was only a suggestion by the governor, that they were looking at smaller numbers.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. Quick question on your policy statement brochure on number 7. I think I know what you're referring to here, but just so I'm not making any assumptions, you talk about the last policy item here, protecting citizens from malicious tampering with such technologies by making tampering a punishable offense. Can you give a couple examples of what you're talking about there?
Yes, gladly. There was an experiment done by Wired Magazine in which they wirelessly hacked into a Jeep, and I believe it was a Grand Cherokee, and disabled the braking system. Many of the autonomous vehicles, and even such as a Tesla currently today, many of the updates are downloaded through the internet. The fear is that someone would maliciously hack into the transportation system and disable the braking of thousands or hundreds of thousands of vehicles simultaneously, create loss of life, serious injury, absolute mayhem. And that is the intent of this, that we want to promote the advancement of automated vehicles, but without some of those dangers. Criminalize it off the bat.
No, that's great. That gets to what I was, that addresses what I was asking about. So it's not just the public infrastructure hacking, but also the individual autonomous vehicles as well. Okay.
You're spot on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I just want to thank Carl for coming and let the board know he does a very good job for us statewide in advocating on our behalf on transportation issues. The MPOAC is made up, of course, as you know, of a conglomerate of all the MPOs across the state with representatives sent. And like I said, Carl does a good job of bringing things to us that represent our interests and going to the Capitol to fight hard for us. So I just want to thank him for coming out today. Give him credit as credit is due for the job he does for us.
Excellent. Greg, you want to?
Well, I'm fortunate to have this job and to work for you. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, a couple of items. One of them goes back to an issue that Commissioner Barfield raised a few weeks ago regarding trains on stopping on public roadways. There's actually been a bill introduced in the House and the Senate that would fine, I guess in essence, CSX, but railroad users in general for anything that's not safety related or mechanical breakdown.
Good job, Betsy.
I don't think, Carl, and I didn't check this, but it hasn't made any progress that I saw. It's basically been introduced, and that's been about it.
They've been referred to committees. It is standard practice that a bill is generally heard by 3 committees. Both bills are referred to 3 committees. On the Senate side, Senator Bean has a bill. He's a phenomenal presenter, excellent debater.
Yeah.
So I would love to see some movement from that bill on the Senate side.
Mr. Chairman, you know, that was an issue that I dealt with when I was in the legislature, Crawfish Island up in Chattahoochee. No ingress, egress, but across that railroad crossing. And it was just that well, first of all, they're a powerful lobby, so don't expect anything to happen with that bill. And I know Senator Bean, he's a really good guy, very passionate, but they are a powerful lobby and an awful neighbor. I mean, we tried to work with them just on a one-on-one basis, and they flat out ignored us. And it's still happening there. It happens in Midway, and obviously in other areas as well. But it was just they weren't willing to budge. So good luck. I mean, I hope it happens because, I mean, we're talking, you know, potentially loss of life. And I know in Midway, even the school bus is parked on the side of the road, on the side of 90 when that train stops right there at the entrance to that apartment complex. And people are just lined up along 90 because they can't get into the complex. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair and Mr. McKissick.
Carl, go with Carl.
We'll get that name right. Do you think a letter of support from the CRTPA would help advance that or help it at all?
I'd be happy to go over and visit with the chair of the first committee and let them know that we're interested in the bill advancing, if they could see their way to then putting it on an agenda.
Do I hear you making a motion that we
Second.
allow Greg
Thank you.
to draft the letter and sign it?
Absolutely.
On behalf of us?
Absolutely.
On that note, Mr. Chair, kind of mixing hats here, but I'm pretty sure we have the problem here they have it in other parts of the state.
Absolutely.
Could you amend that motion not only to include a letter to the state, but also a letter to MPOAC to ask that organization also
Good idea.
a resolution?
Absolutely amended.
Except that is.
Any objection to that? Okay, we'll say that one's passed. On the MPOAC, we've been talking about forming a MPO of sorts for rural areas that are not served by MPO. Have y'all ever discussed that? Like Franklin County, Liberty County, they have no representation.
There is available as an option within the federal statutes, RTPO, so Rural Transportation Plan Organization. That is an avenue that is available. Probably the most likely person to speak with on that would be Chris Doolin, who represents the Small Counties Coalition.
We're actually working on that through the Appalachia Regional Planning Council.
Okay.
So
idea.
I just didn't know if y'all had
Yeah.
discussed that at all, but it is ongoing.
Yeah, we've generally not had that discussion here. One of the things I, as executive director, have maintained is that any deal that relates to transportation funding has to be fair to both the urban and non-urbanized areas. Because you can have an unfair deal for 2, even 3 years in a row, but it's going to haunt you somewhere down the line. Play fair, play nice from the beginning. We all profit, we all come out ahead.
I may have Chris Rito reach out to you. He's the director of
Great call.
ARPC.
Gladly.
Any other question?
Well, and Mr. Chairman, I had one more item, and I believe this one was introduced last week, and this is a priority of the Senate President Galvano. He's put out a bill that lists 3 corridors throughout the state. One of those is called the Suncoast Connector, which is listed as Citrus County to Jefferson County. So that will be one that we'll be keeping an eye on. There's some potential funding implications to this bill. It talks about borrowing money from the State Transportation Trust Fund to fund phases of these projects. One of the interesting things it talks about is if the projects move forward, that money can be paid for after all of the toll bonds are paid, maintenance, operations. The way it's written, I kind of question how much is actually left over if that ever moves forward. So that will be something that we'll be watching to see how that moves forward if it does. And I don't know, Carl, is there a companion bill in the House?
There is not at this time.
Excellent. Thank you for coming.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. Carl, thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
All right, Greg.
Mr. Chairman, the next item up is the Midtown Area Phase 2 kickoff. Mr. Burke's going to project manage this for us, and I'm going to turn it over to him.
Good afternoon, members. We are here today to kick off Phase 2 of the Midtown Area Transportation Plan. Phase 1 was completed in February of last year and actually involved a traffic operations study that came out with some potential options for the Midtown area. Phase 2, which I just said we're kicking off today, actually involves extensive public outreach with stakeholders, citizens, residents. With us today, we have Ryan Weatherall with Kimberly Horn. He's going to actually go into a little bit more detail on this project.
Good afternoon, Board.
Hey, Ryan.
Hi. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. For those that were here last February, we finished up Phase 1, which was a technical analysis looking at viable alternatives. Since that time, we've gotten ourselves prepared to move forward with Phase 2, which is exactly what we're kicking off here today and talking through. But before we really jump into that, we'll give a little bit of an overview of what Phase 1 entailed and then talk about what we have ahead of us. So Phase 1 was a technical analysis that identified viable alternatives from a transportation perspective that could be moved forward for stakeholder and community engagement, be reviewed with the community, be reviewed with stakeholders, and understand what feedback that might include. These are a series of viable alternatives, not necessarily every viable alternative. So as we go through this process, we'll refine these alternatives. We may even add a few to the list if there are some things that come out of this engagement that warrant study and further discussion. But we're kicking off Phase 2, which is that public and stakeholder portion. So our project limits at the north end, Bradford, Benton area, just north of Glenview. To the east, it's Gadsden Street, and it includes Calhoun. To the south, we have Virginia Street, which is just north of Tennessee Street. And then on the west is Bruneau, which in addition to that includes the Duval area. So we've got a robust area here in Midtown that includes businesses, places that people want to be for recreation, restaurants, that kind of thing. But it's also got parks. It's also got neighborhoods. So it's a vibrant area in our community. And so that's part of the reason that we're moving forward with these evaluations and getting public feedback. So here's a graphical analysis of what that study area looks like. It includes Monroe Street and Thomasville Road sort of feeding down into the heart of downtown. As part of that initial aspect of the study, we looked at existing available data. Certainly DOT has a lot of data that they publish. And we gathered that both on the volume side of things as well as from a crash data side of things and looked at that. In addition, our planning department maintains a robust set of data as it relates to sidewalks and crosswalks and that kind of thing here in town. And so we use that as a basis as well for looking at other modes of transportation. The city traffic ops group maintains the signal timings and the volumes at each of the signalized intersections. We gathered that information as well. We did collect some of our own data, though, and that was origin destination data. And we collected that during the spring, sort of at the end of the spring, so that we had, when FSU students were still here and the legislature was still in town, but we also collected it after they had left to see if there was any real difference in patterns. Surprisingly, to me, there wasn't a real big difference in patterns. I sort of expected to see that, but it wasn't in the data suggesting that people were coming to or coming through in a different fashion in this Midtown area. So Phase 1 identified these viable alternatives for further study. There were a few alternatives that we evaluated, though, that didn't make it through the process. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I know this matrix is small on the screen. Hopefully you guys have it in front of you and can see it a little bit better. But this was the tool that we used to evaluate each of the alternatives considered. And the ones at the top, the 6 at the top, are the ones that are moving into this second phase. The 3 at the bottom were the ones that were deemed to not be viable for further study. We looked at this not only from a quantitative perspective, but also from a qualitative or community-based perspective. So we looked at level of service and operations of the network, but we also looked at what does this mean from a placemaking perspective and an ability to calm traffic and accommodate additional modes. We did give some consideration to what it meant from an impact as it relates to construction and right-of-way, just ranking those on a high, medium, and low type of basis. You'll see at the bottom, the three that we're not spending a whole lot of time with unless you all have questions are the creating of bi-directional roadways along 6th and 7th. Those were found to not be viable from an operational perspective and warranted significant improvements at Monroe Street and Thomasville Road to accommodate those new movements. The other are the two roundabout alternatives we considered there at 5 points, if you will, 7th and Thomasville and Meridian. So those two alternatives are not moving forward. I'll quickly move through the ones, though, that we are considering. The first is the realignment of Beard Street. And this is to sort of clean up the operations there near Table 23. And if you've ever come in off of Gadsden to Table 23 in that parking lot, it's a little bit squirrely as to where should you turn and what does that operation look like. So again, this is an opportunity to line up the western leg with the eastern leg and clean up the operations. There's both a vertical and horizontal curve in Gadsden there. And so by moving the alignment a little bit further to the north, we take out some of that conflict with the curve. The next, I mentioned sidewalks. We identified a number of sidewalk gaps in this Midtown area, and so wanted to have discussions about those as we move forward. Find out if there are other gaps. We didn't focus in Phase 1 a whole lot on crosswalks, but we'll pick that up as we move into Phase 2, making sure that connectivity is an integral part of what we're including here. You can see on the map where we've really identified the parks in the area, and there are a handful of those, several of them which are more major regional type parks in this area, and connecting those so that you don't necessarily have to drive during beautiful weather like today is another aspect of this. So we talk about the Gadsden Street as a sidewalk opportunity. We're coordinating with our other partners in town. We've talked ongoing since Phase 1 and now into Phase 2 with Leon County as they are moving the western piece there between 6th and 7th forward, which is a great addition to this part of the network. We'll continue to have those conversations with the city and county staff and others that may have an impact as we go forward to make sure that we've got the latest and greatest information baked in there. Placemaking in complete streets. This is a great reminder. The pieces that we are recommending to move forward with at this time aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Placemaking is one of those key alternatives that can be incorporated with many of the viable solutions. And we've got several great examples in this community that have been developed over the last few years, Franklin to Great Gaines to FAMU, each of which have some commonality, but also have unique features that speak to the neighborhoods and areas in which they're included. And so we'll consider placemaking in complete streets as we move forward. One-waying of Thomasville Road. This is one that garnered a pretty good bit of discussion last year. And certainly we're moving it forward based on the recommendation of the board at that time. But there's some pros and there's some cons to this. And we'll have to evaluate those and get feedback as we move forward. Certainly from an operational perspective, we've evaluated it and found it to be viable. It provides the opportunity to reduce the footprint of Thomasville Road through this area from 3 lanes to 2 lanes and still work satisfactorily in partnership with the other north routes such as Gadsden and Duval in this area along with Monroe Street. It allows for the accommodation of a movement from Meridian onto Thomasville now, something that we don't have today where you're forced to make that right turn onto 7th. So by narrowing up the footprint, we have the opportunity for more placemaking. Now, certainly there are some concerns with one-ways, and what does that mean from a business access perspective, and what does that mean from a friction, if you will, from opposing traffic? We'll evaluate those things as we move forward and have discussions regarding that, but that's all part of what Phase 2 is supposed to do. Now, this ties into Calhoun to head southbound. It has that parallel to the east there of Gadsden to get back north in the evening peak. Now, the next option as it relates to one-way is a little bit of a different example. This is, you carry two-way traffic all the way up to 6th. 6th is a road that heads to the east, carries traffic over towards the hospital if you're not familiar with the naming in that Midtown area. 7 is its parallel that comes back to the west. And by doing this, you create almost a block about. And that is, you have the east movement on 6th complemented by the west movement on 7th. You have the south movement on Thomasville complemented by the north movement on Gadsden. And so the idea here is that you create sort of that circular movement through that area. It also allows for some of the other benefits being you can connect Meridian in here to head southbound into the Midtown area, something that, again, is not accommodated today. In evaluating this alternative, we assumed all of the traffic would go north to the 6th Avenue intersection, make a right, and then make a left on Gadsden. It operates satisfactorily doing that. However, much of this traffic is local and would likely move over to Gadsden a little bit earlier rather than getting all the way up and having to make a right and then a left. So we've evaluated that and are moving that forward at this time. So let's talk about Phase 2 and where we're going. So Phase 2 will build on what was done in Phase 1. It'll allow for further discussion, refinement. It'll also include more focus on bicycle, pedestrian, and transit alternatives. And it'll be an opportunity for further input from our stakeholders and, of course, the public as we move forward. So public outreach begins soon. We're in the process of developing a survey as we speak. And in partnership with our partners at the city, we will be joining them next Monday for a meeting with the Midtown Association and some of the work that they're doing. So that's next Monday on the 25th. So community events like that will be partnering. We had looked to hopefully partner with Toluca Fest, but unfortunately that's not moving forward this year. And so there'll be other opportunities for community events, public workshops, and stakeholder meetings that we will take advantage of. So we'll refine alternatives following that engagement and prepare for finishing Phase 2 of this planning effort towards the end of this year. So.
You don't need to raise your things unless you really want to.
Okay.
Go ahead, Diane.
I wanted to thank you. Very good job. I've already began to receive some pushback on the one-way on Thomasville Road, and I promised the individual who was sending it to me that I would note it, and we just kind of watch it, and I'm pretty sure that they'll be participating in those community events and public workshops. But if you could address, because in what I'm reading here, it could have impact on the businesses if we went with a one-way southbound. What would be a remedy to try to offset any impact to the businesses if that option was what we decided to go with?
Go ahead. Okay. I think the key to this is that you have a parallel 1 block away in Gadsden. The other, and you're right, we need to evaluate this and we need to talk with the businesses as we go forward. There's one piece that I missed noting in here. There are other communities across the country that use facilities like this to create walkable promenades on weekends and that kind of thing. By having parallels to Thomasville Road, it may be that on Friday night you close down Thomasville through that entire area. It becomes a pedestrian promenade. So there are things that, yes, there may be some trade-offs, if you will. It's also the ability to go from a 3-lane section down to a 2-lane section, picking up additional space maybe for wider sidewalks, maybe for on-street parking that does create that friction that we're giving in trade-out. But certainly at this point, we're just looking at viable alternatives that to get that kind of feedback. If there's concern, then maybe that's not the right solution for this part of our community. So we'll want to have that dialogue as we go through this process. But you're right. With any kind of change, there are benefits and then there are challenges, and we just need to evaluate those and determine what that looks like.
Because I think it's also important to realize that Midtown grew organically thanks to the businesses. So we certainly want to make sure that they remain up front in our thought processes and how we can make sure we keep that a thriving district.
Absolutely.
Rick, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Mr. Vice Chair. Ryan, good job. I mean, your job, the job that you were tasked with for Phase 1 was to identify options, and you've done that. I like Commissioner Williams-Cox, I'm skeptical of the one-way, the 2 southbound options for Thomasville. One thing, if you can, spend a moment talking about your efforts on public input and what you're going to do. I'd like to, in particular, hear what feedback you get from the businesses along Thomasville. I drive down that road almost twice a day, and I think a lot of the businesses there, I suspect, would be concerned about this. But you obviously need to go through and explain the pros and the cons. So if you could talk about that, what efforts are you going to have to reach out to the public and specifically the businesses along Thomasville? And then the second part is, it's quite a bit of a rush hour at 5-ish every workday, and Thomasville is filled with people getting to their northeast residences. If you were to basically have Thomasville, that section, be southbound, are you sure at this point that Gadsden can accommodate the increased traffic going north to get home?
We've evaluated that redistribution of traffic, and our analyses suggest, in this preliminary planning phase, that it is viable for further study. I can't be 100% certain because we haven't gotten to that level of specificity, but at the high level that we screened these, it suggests that it could, yes.
I'm skeptical of the one-way options, but I'm having an open mind, and again, I want to commend you for presenting options to us. There's no downside to presenting things that are on the table, so thank you.
Thank you.
You want to hear about the outreach?
Yeah, do you want to talk?
Yes,
okay.
please. Yeah, thank you.
So from an outreach perspective, there's a number of communities, if you will, there. There's the community that just drives through Midtown. Maybe they live in that northeast part, but they work downtown. Yeah. And so Monday through Friday, they're driving through as a throughput. We've got to be able to engage that group. We can't forget about them. There's the business community that's their livelihood that's there. We have to engage that group. There are the neighborhoods that surround that area, and we have to engage them. So we're doing several things. We're doing the survey, and the survey is hopefully that broad brush approach of catching the people maybe that don't stop in Midtown, but get their feedback. The folks that live maybe to the north, or that maybe live downtown and have to go out to I-10 and get on the interstate, or whatever the case may be. So that's an aspect of it. The community events and the community workshops, just like tag teaming with our partners next Monday to get in front of some of that Midtown working group. We want to do that. We want to create awareness. We're going to get connected with the businesses. I think it's Don at Waterworks has said anytime that we want to get the businesses together, he will be more than happy to accommodate and help facilitate that. So we're using that as a tool as well. And then getting with the neighborhoods. Certainly there are a number of neighborhood groups in this area and trying to reach out and connect with them. So we recognize that there's different populations that use and work and live in this area, and we're trying to connect as best we can with each of those.
Okay,
Thank you. Next, and then you, Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Commissioner brought up a good job. A good point in that your job was to bring us options. You did a very good job of bringing us some solid options here. But Commissioner Williams-Cox and Commissioner Minor both noted the one-way being an issue for them because of public comment. It's so much of an issue for me, not only because of public comment, but because of your own notes in there that it would restrict business access, that I don't know why we continue to even keep it on the table. And so I don't know if this is an action item, but it would be my preference. Now I know what this does to this item, because the only other option is Beer Street they have on the table. But it would be my preference that we take those two options off the table. And if you need to go back to the drawing board to maybe look at other options to give us more options, I would rather do that than look at an option that through your own analysis says that it restricts access to businesses. We all know what we're trying to do to Midtown. City of Tallahassee is probably more familiar with it than the county is. But as much as it is about moving cars in that area, it's more about being multimodal and moving people. Mm-hmm. And so, it would be my preference that we took them off the table. I don't know what kind of action item this is, but I'm not going to make a motion to that effect yet, because I would like to hear from everybody else on that point. But if it comes back, if we don't take it off the table today and it comes back that one of those options wins out, I won't be supporting it. Just for the simple fact that it does say very plainly that it restricts business access.
It wasn't advertised as an agenda action item, so I don't think it'd be appropriate at this time, because there may have been citizens that wanted to come to the meeting to speak if they knew a decision was going to be made.
I understand.
If you think that's appropriate.
For that reason, because it's not an action item, I'll just make my comment and say that if one way's come back, I won't be supporting it for the simple reason that it would restrict business access. And Mr. Attorney, I believe, it's not in the proper order to receive a motion anyway, is it? Because it's not an action item?
Actually, what we did a few months back, maybe a year back, I was concerned about how we agended items, and we reformatted the agenda such that we listed action items, and that gave you the flexibility to do whatever
So it is
you wanted
listed
to
as
do.
an action.
It can, you can,
Section, but we listed this specifically as
Discussion item.
right, so that you can act on it however you felt accordingly.
Thank you. So technically, we could take action, but even before I even go there, I would like to hear more conversation from the board on that statement of just taking it off the table. Again, I appreciate the options. I think you guys did an excellent job in bringing those options forward. I even appreciate your analysis and what those one-ways actually do, or the flexibility it gives us. But I'm so interested in making sure that Midtown continues to be a place, will continue to go into a destination where people are going to come walk the neighborhood, have access to those businesses, and patronize those businesses, anything that says business access restricted, I'm just not willing to entertain.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Curtis?
Two things. Does this take into consideration the planned development of the point in Midtown and the parking garage and businesses along the point?
So that was just conceptual, I think, a little more than a year ago. So there wasn't any real specific consideration of that when we developed Phase 1 activity. Certainly, as we move into Phase 2, they will be a stakeholder, and that would help to shape what comes out of Phase 2.
Okay, because we did hear from the property owner that he plans to develop that property and the parking garage. So that will have a lot to do with how traffic is routed as well, given ingress and egress from the parking garage and what happens along Thomasville Road.
Right.
I'm always reluctant to do one-ways as well, but I certainly want to give you all the opportunity to collect as much information and data as possible before we, Commissioner Maddox, make a final decision. And I think you all are still in the information gathering, data gathering mode at this point. So I think it might be a little premature for us in this setting to make that decision until we've got all of the information to make that decision on. So that would be my only reluctance in considering it today when we don't have all of that information to make a vote on. But I too am certainly concerned about the business access in that area. But if we do want to make it a walkable area, then we're talking about pedestrian access more than transportation access. Because I would imagine, when I'm in that area, it looks more like people are coming through than parking to access the businesses. That's my perception, whenever I'm in that Midtown area, that they're just kind of passing through Midtown to get to Monroe Street or where it points south. So I would, in all due respect, Commissioner, that, until we have all of the information in which to make a decision, that we ought to wait until we have all of that before us, before we make that final decision, although I certainly agree with you, Commissioner Williams-Cox and Commissioner Minor, in your concerns. I've seen one-ways just not have a very positive impact on business districts that way. So,
and real quickly to your point of the traffic through,
yes.
I think that's a fair assessment during the normal business hours. Our partners at DOT provided us with some information related to pedestrian counts a little bit further towards the northern end near 7th. Over 400 crossings, and that wasn't a game day weekend on the weekend that they collected it. So you get out, and that's part of our statement of making sure we're engaging all the communities. Daylight hours, it's a throughput, to downtown and a connection, but it changes character on the weekends and in the evenings as well. So we want to make sure that we're capturing feedback from all users and that we're accommodating not only the motoring public, but the non-motoring public as well. So that's the intent of what we're doing, and then provide you guys with that data to help make the decision on where we go as a community.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just to follow up, because, one of the things that we were even looking at when we were discussing the parking garage, or the parking situation in Midtown, is not traffic in the area, but where do people park and access those businesses from a pedestrian perspective. So it's more about walkability and access from that perspective than cars actually accessing those businesses from Monroe Street.
Diane?
Also, two quick things. I noticed that in your presentation, you said you measured when FSU students are in town. I would ask that you broaden your horizon and do it with all students, because even though FAMU is on the southern end of the city, there are people who visit who will come to Midtown for night entertainment or shopping or what have you. So that's one thing I mentioned to you, to broaden your spectrum there. And the other thing is knowing the feedback that you received today on the one-way of Thomasville Road. As you're collecting your additional data or information, perhaps looking to make the case why it should be, because I think you're going to find that the data you will collect will give you all the reasons why it shouldn't be. But just to kind of play the devil's advocate to try to make the case for it, knowing that when you get back here, we still may not change our minds on it, but at least you will have the data to support it.
Well, and to that point, I mean, that's exactly what we want to do, is present the facts to you all so that you can make an informed decision.
So your name is Joe Friday now.
Greg, do you want?
I don't know, there was 3 or 4 points on it, so I hope I don't miss any. Going back to Commissioner Richards initially on the parking garage, we coordinated extensively with the city as they went through that process, and will continue to do so as we move forward with this. And there is talk of doing a Midtown plan update in conjunction with the committee that's meeting now, so we'll do a lot of coordination with them. Back to the point on one-way streets, I was always hesitant to kind of call these alternatives, because that implies that we're going to select one of these to move forward, and that's not necessarily the case. But I would encourage that we leave it in there for now, because one of the issues that we've got with this section of road is we're extremely limited on right-of-way. One-way does provide some alternatives to improve those pedestrian connections. I think what Ryan was talking about when he references in the text is it does provide some restriction to vehicular traffic, and that's part of the conversation we want to have when we meet with the Merchants Association, folks like that. What are you willing to trade off to improve that pedestrian access? So I would much prefer to leave it in there as an option, see what kind of feedback we get. My gut tells me, by and large, the business owners aren't going to be enthused with it, but at least we can have that conversation.
Take it off the table.
Right, but at least we've vetted that to see, there are certain things, the overall goal of this plan was to make Midtown more pedestrian accessible. Yes. Thomasville, in its current configuration, does not allow us to do that. Is it worth it to reconfigure it? So that's, I would prefer to leave it, but going back to Commissioner Maddox's original question, you all have the authority to do that now. It would be my recommendation that you not, and let's wait and at least vet this through the public involvement process.
Mr. Chair, in light of the comments and the
Eloquent
statement,
statement.
especially from the city commissioners, since they are working hard on this area, I would not dare make that motion, but I do stand firmly against it based off of what I'm seeing today. I'll try to be as open-minded as I can in the future with the analysis that comes back, but I won't make the motion for it.
Rick?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ryan, I'm preaching to the choir. You and I just talked about it before the meeting started. This actually, these options on the table are exactly at the right point for public input. And as you're seeking public input, you know this as well as I do. Just make sure that people know these options are just options. Nothing's been decided. This is a stage where the public is where we want to hear what they have to say, and this is their opportunity to voice those concerns. And so, one thing that I know we've all had in recent years is when the public is presented with things, often they think that the decision's already been made. And so you've seen that as well as we have. So if you just emphasize that as you're seeking public input, and then we will act on the public input.
Well, just leaving it in there at least means it's been looked at and it's been
Vetted.
If it's been vetted and it's been decided not to do it, you can say you did look at it.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one other thing that I wanted to add, we're considering the scooter option. If we did go with the one-way and we're able to widen the sidewalks, because that's where the scooters would be, then that gives us that option as well. So just another component to think about when you're evaluating that alternative.
And that's exactly right. We did not, in this phase, develop any typical sections, if you will, cross-sections of what you might use that extra space for. I mentioned on-street parking as a buffer, and it slows traffic down. You could use it for a dedicated bike lane. That does then potentially create some conflicts and with all the driveways and maybe does reduce vehicular access to businesses, but it also provides for an opportunity for widening of the sidewalks to exactly that point, the scooter opportunity, and giving them more space so they're not running up against the walking public, if you will. So a lot of opportunities, but you're right. We've got a lot to still vet out with the community.
Betsy, you're the only person. You don't say anything?
I live in Jefferson, but I do drive there. I just went by there. I'm anxious to see what you're going to do.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, though.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah.
Very good work, yeah.
All right. Greg?
Mr. Chairman, the next item was an amendment to the bylaws that was requested last month. Our attorneys have drafted some language that provides some additional flexibility to the board in terms of the membership of the executive committee, which is currently the chair, vice chair, and past chair. We provided the additional language in your agenda item. In essence, I would say on an annual basis, you all can review and determine whether or not you want to add members to the committee. So we're just seeking approval or any other action from the board.
Now, we discussed at one time about forming an audit committee. Was that correct to go?
Yeah, but I think during the executive committee last month, you all went away from that. But still, the executive committee would review the annual audit as part of its regular duty.
You need a vote on this item?
Yes, sir.
Everybody
So
familiar
is
with it?
amendment.
Move approval, Mr. Chairman.
Second.
There is one clarification on 4A, the fourth line, the executive committee meet at least 1 week prior. I think there's some Scrivener error somewhere in there.
Okay.
So just take a look at that.
And thank you, Commissioner. That is the one change that I did make was rather than do it 2 weeks, do it 1 week. Because we sometimes have problems getting them scheduled 2 weeks. So I moved that back to a week prior.
Committee at
To
meet
meet.
at least. It's just
Yeah.
Grammar.
I saw it. I wasn't going to say anything, Betsy. Thank you. Diane, do you want?
No, I was just saying it's grammar.
Yeah.
I'll
Okay.
I guess it would be, do we need
Authorize staff to,
do we
correct
need to
Scrivener error.
amend the motion to, okay,
Allow-
I'll accept the
allow for
motion as
Scrivener
a,
error.
I think the gist
Yeah.
is still the same.
okay, all right.
Okay, any objections? I will consider it passed. Now we have DOT. Bryant?
The department doesn't have any specific updates for this meeting, but I'd be glad to answer any questions
Now's
the
the
body may
time for
have.
questions if you got
Yes.
for DOT. Betsy?
Yeah. So I heard from Kerry Harrell about the divots in the road, and they're looking at that, Mr. Polk. But something came to my attention today on Highway 90, Lake Miccosukee. There's a catwalk there, and DOT or Ferrovial has put up no parking along that right-of-way, along the sides of the road. And that is such a busy area. And when the crappie are biting, there are a bunch of people on that catwalk. And I don't know what we can do about parking there. They are parking right up against, they are parking in between your no parking signs. Yeah. So I just bring it to your attention because obviously my people are not paying attention to DOT, and you wag your finger at them and they're just like, whatever, I'm going to go get those crappie anyway. But, and it only happens when that you have your overspill going too. So let's take a look at that and see what we can do. I mentioned that there's parking on the other side of the road, but of course that's a boat landing parking, and Leon County needs to do a little bit of work on their side over there to fix it up a little bit, which I'll talk to you about soon. But anyway, I'm just concerned about the folks, and a lot of those people are elderly that fish there.
Okay.
I wouldn't be one of them, but
That fish or that's elderly?
either.
Those are your peeps.
Yeah, those are my peeps. There is no doubt.
Curtis?
Paul, Brian, I just wanted to let
Thank
you know that I met you all's chief of staff the other day, Torrey Alston. He's a wonderful young man. I knew Torrey when he was a student at FAMU.
Okay.
very bright, I think he'll do a wonderful job there at DOT.
Okay, I'm sure he will. Thank you.
One quick bellyache, well, two, every meeting I got a bellyache about 319 in Leon County on the south side. And then the other one is on Woodville Highway northbound, you know where Revels
Yes.
Eats is there?
Yes.
There's a school sign that flashes school zone, but there is no in-school zone going north. I know that's a state road, I don't know who maintains those signs. There is a school sign and an in-school zone going south, but I guess because of Revels Meats being right there, there is no in-school sign. So you don't know when you can speed back up, in other words.
Okay.
In school zone.
You can't.
END.
You can't speed up.
Well, you can after you get through the school zone, right?
No. You got to cruise right on into town.
Trying to get the pick and pull, I don't know,
That's right, Commissioner. Make sure you take it all in.
Scenic route.
All right, anybody got anything else for DOT? Now's the time. All right, Greg?
Fairly quiet this month. The one thing we did want to start bringing to you every month, we included in your agenda packet, is a monthly update.
I like
of our
that.
Planning projects and the status. Thank you, ma'am.
I like it more when Jefferson's on there.
We got the trail on there. Jefferson County Trail. And also, too, the major construction projects, and we'll look to kind of add to that as we go along, but at least give you kind of a monthly snapshot of all the projects and any meetings that we've had.
That's really helpful.
Anything like that. So, Chairman, that's all I have.
Okay, and the information item, was that you, future meeting dates?
Next month, the 20th, I believe?
16.
16th, okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Any items from board members?
I said my piece.
Speak now. Okay, we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job, an hour.